Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, this is an orientation event for education, childhood, youth and sport. And in this session, we tackle a very, very important issue for all students, which is critical thinking. Now, I'm joined by Gill Clifton to explain this mysterious phenomenon. And Gill, your take on this is that critical thinking is something that we actually all do every day. And you've brought some water bottles with you, so I'm delighted to see that this is something that we should all be able to pick up, because Jane and Alison have told me that it's very, very important to master critical thinking at postgraduate level. And indeed, often at level 3, students are increasingly asked to be able to critically analyse. But for some of us, it can be a bit of a mystery.
It can be a mystery, absolutely. And there is this perception, I think, when students are studying, that it's going to happen automatically and students will get to know and understand what critical thinking is all about, whereas actually it is quite a difficult thing. But you hit on the right point, that it is actually something that we do every day. And when I was teaching, the kind of example I would give my students, for example, would be that, you wouldn't go out and buy a washing machine without thinking about, OK, how much am I going to spend on this? Where is it going to be positioned in the kitchen? Will it go under the unit, for example? And I made a mistake about that on one occasion as well. But those kind of questions you automatically ask yourself if you're going to purchase something, or if you're going to organise a holiday or whatever. You would ask those kind of questions. And actually that's the fundamental aspect of what critical thinking is. And a lot of students make the mistake of thinking that it's to criticise, and it's not really. Although criticism does come into it, as we will discover when we get into the scenario, but it isn't necessarily about criticising, it's about asking those key questions of something or information that is being presented to you.
So we've asked you at home, what do you think best describes what it means to think critically? Now, these are multi-choice options, so you'll see a number of things that you can fill in our interactive tools. All you do for the multi-choice questions is open the widget, click on the option that applies to you and return to send, and you can then see what everyone else at home has said also. And the other question that we've asked is, which aspect is most important? For the author, the ability to defend the argument, or for the reader, being able to assess the evidence for the argument. So let us know what you think. Also, HJ is in the chat box, so let us know any questions or feedback, or what you had for dinner, and we will introduce that. I'm still here with the sport and fitness team came and talked about studying like an athlete.
Food,
I have got food. I've been working my way through nuts and fruit, which I've been told is a very
healthy,
good idea. So I'm feeling
healthy.
very virtuous. So, Joan, you have these bottles.
Yes, I thought I would give you a scenario to try and demystify this concept. So, and I was reading an article on the web the other day about a study that had been conducted to do with recycling. So this notion of recycling, well, this is what we're encouraged to do, very much so. And in particular, water bottles, with the heat of the summer that we've had, although it's not quite the heat this evening.
Anymore,
but
no.
yeah, but we have been encouraged to ensure that we hydrate and we drink plenty of water. So therefore this notion of carrying water bottles with us, but also recycling, so reusing the water bottles. This couple of studies were reported on in this particular article. One of them was conducted by a professor who looked into, it was a Canadian study, and he looked into, over a period of a week, the bottles that students were reusing and refilling up, their water bottles that they were refilling up. And then he examined the top of those bottles, and 2/3 of them contained bacteria, and it was bacteria actually that could cause an awful lot of damage. If anyone's had food poisoning, you will know that it's not a very particularly pleasant experience. So that was quite an interesting aspect to this article. Second study that was reported on was in connection with looking at, OK, if we then have this build-up of bacteria on these water bottles, what is a way that we can get away from that? And that would be to wash it, to ensure that actually we wash in soapy water, hot water. But then the second article, or the second study, was looking at the contamination that can be caused when heat is applied to different types of plastic. I'm no scientist, so forgive me, I haven't got the language here, but actually there's the chemical compounds that plastic is made up with, when it's heated to a very high temperature, can go into the water. So again, a bit of a sort of a dodgy thing to do. But also in this article, same article, there was a report from social media. So a number of people, I think it was something like about 13 people, had said, oh, come on, I've been doing this for years. I've been recycling and reusing my water bottle for years. I've never been ill. I've never had a problem with this. So when you're faced with these three different perspectives, how do you actually make a decision? How do you come to some kind of conclusion about what the best answer to this particular recycling problem would be? So it's about examining the evidence and also asking those critical questions about the evidence that you're being presented with. But what also underpins that is the context that you are coming from. So take our scenario about being ill and the bacteria. If you've had food poisoning, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe your friends that have been doing this for many years and never had a problem? Or if you've actually really suffered food poisoning, are you going to think, oh, that doctor is right, I'm going to stay away from this? Or if you have a medical condition, so it depends on your own particular context as to where you're going to lay the weight of the evidence that is being presented to you. So context too is very important. And that is thinking critically about the situation and bearing in mind those different perspectives and coming to a conclusion based on the evidence that you're being presented with.
So what you're saying is there's no right or wrong answer to this question.
No, absolutely.
It very much depends on your own perspective and who you choose to believe. I mean, some of these sources, in particular some of the medical sources, you think might have more weight,
yes,
for example,
than
others.
A scientist, exactly, yes.
So to some extent, your argument is that it's about evaluating that weight and the extent to which those arguments then have an impact.
Yes, but it's also based on your own personal experience as well. That comes back to the context. So if you, as I say, if you have been ill and you have had food poisoning, you're going to think, well, actually, I'm going to stay well away from that, even though perhaps there's others that will be saying that they've been doing it and not had a problem. And the other aspect of weighing up that weight is to think about how that information was actually produced and developed. So, for example, that first study I was referring to, where they examined the top of the bottle, there were 78 students' bottles that they examined over the period of a week. Well, is that a good presentation of, or example of the population and the recycling that takes place of water bottles? I'm not sure perhaps that is a good representation of that. And what about the evidence then in connection with the heat as well? We are told actually that if you put things into a dishwasher and you wash them at high temperature, you're actually sterilising. So wouldn't that do? And if there are different types of plastic, shouldn't it be in terms of the plastic that we're examining and how that performs then in terms of the heat as well? And then we're back to an experience, the experience example as well with the students, with the social media comments. What were those people's experiences? Had any of them actually experienced food poisoning? So again, it's about examining how the evidence was actually produced and the context in which it was produced, as well as your own context of how you're receiving that information.
So you've mentioned two key areas here, Gill. One is the sample, and
Yeah.
you can be critical about the sample. And I think many students find it very easy. You mentioned before that you know, critical thinking is slightly more than that, but it can be easy to say, well, this sample is small. This sample, because their students may not have the best dishwashing facilities or hygiene standards, etc.
Exactly.
But you've raised other concerns which are more parallel. So you're saying, well, look at that, but in another context.
Yes.
How does this make sense in terms of my understanding of the world?
Yes.
And it's that side, I think, that we do every day, perhaps, you know, unconsciously.
Automatically, yeah, without really sort of thinking about it. Those kind of questions that we're questioning ourselves. And that way of thinking about things naturally comes from our own experiences. How we interpret something will come from our own experiences. So if as a student you are faced with information, perhaps you're asked to critically evaluate an article. So you're looking at that article, you're reading through the article, you're examining the weight of it, you're thinking about how many people were in the sample, if it was a research study, for example. Is it persuasive? Are the authors persuading me that this is a sound piece of work? But you're also looking at that article from your perspective as well, from your own experiences, and that's adding to the weight of your judgment.
OK, now we asked people at home what they thought best describes critical thinking.
Right.
And let's take a look at what they had to say. You've given 3 choices here, Gill. Let's see what everyone at home said. 90% say analysing the evidence of the argument, its robustness, persuasive, credibility. Is it fit for purpose?
Good. Excellent.
But that's the longest answer, Gill, so I wonder if you've biased that slightly. Because you've said that viewing things from different perspectives is very important.
Yes.
And also testing the soundness of a claim of an argument is very important.
Yes.
Does that evidence really support the claims that are being made? So why is it about the robustness, persuasiveness and credibility that is so important?
Well, I think it's because how you then use that information, how you're then going to use it. And so you, as the reporter, if you like, if you're using it, for example, in your own essay, you then have to persuade your reader that what you're saying has some credibility. So if you've examined the robustness of the argument that you're using, you then take that argument, you reposition it within your own context, and then you're arguing using that evidence, then that has to be equally as robust, because you then have to produce the evidence of your own argument. So it is about being sure yourself that the information that you're taking forward into your own essays and the arguments that you are presenting is a robust argument, so that you can defend it in your own writing.
OK, but there are other perspectives as well on all of this, because we've seen some claims, we've seen some tight pieces of evidence, but you've also explained the importance of thinking in a parallel way.
Yeah.
So there are other arguments. I mean, one of them that I'm thinking about is the sort of harm to the planet. I mean, one of the premises of recycling bottles of water is that they don't then, you know, cause a lot of heat and recycling, etc., and expense of all of that. But washing creates heat with the water. The detergent can be a pollutant. So if we were looking at it in terms of saving the planet, there might be a very different story.
Absolutely. So when you're making your argument and you're reinterpreting it perhaps in a different context, that's a very good way to get a critical perspective on it. Again, advice I always give my students is a good way of injecting criticality into your argument is to compare and contrast. So if you see something in this particular perspective or in this particular way, and then look at it from a different perspective or in a different context, actually what you're doing, you're comparing and contrasting. So you're making a very good examination, you're analysing that particular piece of information because you're showing it in a different light. And that can work very well, particularly at master's level students, when they start to apply or adapt some information that they may have read in the module materials to their own workplace, to their own context, which may well be different from that in which the original information was presented. So that comparing and contrasting is a good way to inject criticality into your argument.
So going with this idea, if one was to propose something based on, say, the food poisoning, for example,
yes,
it would be positioned within that reader's context.
Yes.
That writer's context. They would be advocating which evidence they felt was better, perhaps considering the other evidence, but then perhaps presenting a parallel argument.
Absolutely. Looking at it from an environmental perspective, actually, it would perhaps critique the original argument, but it isn't necessarily a criticism. You're not necessarily saying that's a wrong argument. You're just actually looking at it from a different perspective. Sometimes you can actually totally disagree and put a completely different argument forward in a totally different perspective. But it isn't necessarily a right or wrong, as we said right from the beginning.
And I think what's interesting about that alternative perspective is that it's got nothing to do with the origin of the evidence. So again, it's about drawing threads together within, I guess, an area and being able to say, well, in evaluating this very specific thing, we can use it from this perspective. I mean, the other thing is, of course, that, you know, drinking water on the go is really important. So from an individual perspective, you could say, well, it's very healthy. It's healthier to have a lot more water than a little bit of bacteria. In fact, it might flush it all out.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, so again, what you have done there is to view the argument from a different point of view, from a different technical as well as perhaps even political or social point of view. Yeah, absolutely.
And when students are doing this with a paper, which would be very specific, might they then be using these things like the health or the environment argument almost in terms of different perspectives, perhaps different methodologies? What sorts of frameworks might they then use to apply to evaluate this evidence in that sort of parallel way?
Well, certainly in terms of master's level study, what we very much encourage students to do is to take the information that they're reading and think about it in their own context, in their own. It might be in a school environment, it might be a working environment, an office environment, it might be a totally different profession. We have students that come in particular to the leadership and management pathway that I work on, that come from very different professions. Educational, it might be from health, but working in education, but from a health perspective. So there might be an argument, for example, an article that has been written that shows evidence of a research study that has taken place in a school environment, and they are taking the outcomes from that and thinking about it in a health situation. So again, it's reapplying it to a different context. That would be a critical engagement with that article because they're thinking about it from something that they have experienced and that they know very well themselves.
Excellent. So we've gone through this analogy. I'd like to take a quick trip to HJ and see how everyone is at home, and then I'd like to return and ask about how we actually go about doing some of this in practice. HJ, how is everyone at home?
We're all good. We're having some great conversation about considering postgraduate study going on from our last session. We're also having some good conversation about critical thinking as well. So Kieran's talking about thinking critically and writing critically. It's about drawing conclusions based upon a reliable and contemporary evidence base. And Anne's also really appreciating Kieran's input. Kieran's done a lot of postgraduate stuff himself, and I can also see Davin's also said you have to consider the influences on the author when they're writing about something as well, which is a really interesting point.
Very interesting point.
Well, that's perfect, because one thing we asked our audience was which aspect they thought was most important, either for the author, the ability to defend the argument, or for the reader, being able to assess the evidence for the argument. Shall we see what they had to say?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're on 92% saying that it's more important for the reader to be able to assess the evidence for the argument rather than for the author. These people are not writing, clearly.
Absolutely.
They're reading, which is good.
Which is good, yeah. But I think it probably is an equal weight, to be honest, because if you're reading an article and you're thinking, yes, but, you know, the cohort here in the research study was only 10 people and they're making all these claims and they're not giving evidence to support those claims, then actually it's been written in a very poor way. And it's not persuading you as the reader. So an author has to take account of that. And if you put yourself in that position when you're actually producing your own assignments, you then become the author. So therefore, you've got to be persuasive in the argument that you're putting forward. And that's when you can draw on other course material, perhaps even other articles that you've read, as well as the one that you're critically examining, to actually provide that evidence, to build up that bank of evidence to support what you're saying.
Now, I wonder, Gill, if partly people have voted for the reader being able to assess the evidence for the argument, because sometimes you can read a paper and you think, oh, well, this has been published in a really reputable journal.
Yes.
And it seems to make sense, and it's been peer-reviewed, and, oh, they've got good jobs, they're at a good university. What they're saying must make an awful lot of sense. It's just that I don't really understand what's going on here. And sometimes
Yes.
I'll unpick an article and think, actually, I'm not really quite certain what the point is. Perhaps they've done something that's very small or very specific. And perhaps sometimes it's very convoluted and perhaps not very well written as well, because you do come across a lot of, you know, variety.
So it's inaccessible.
Yeah. So there's this balance, I think, between obviously a good author will present an argument very clearly and very well, but equally that doesn't happen all the time. So it's important for readers to be able to unpick some of those aspects. Now, you've shown us how we might start to unpick some of those things, but what sort of strategies might you offer to students then in terms of how they actually go about doing some of that, how they look at some of these papers that can seem, as I say, very correct?
Yeah, well, I think mostly it would be papers, probably articles, journal articles that you're going to be looking at. I always go, first of all, to the abstract. What is the abstract telling me? And usually you've got all the information there. It should tell you what was produced, what the topic is, how it was produced, so how the study took place, and what the findings were. If it isn't made up of that, actually, if you don't get that clear picture, then actually I probably wouldn't read any further, because that's telling you the essence that this is a good, standard, organised piece of work. Then I would actually look at the discussion part, because it's in the discussion section, which is right at the end, when actually the author should be starting to bring those threads that we were talking about, bring those threads together. So talking about the findings from the research study that was conducted, how that links to what was already known about that particular topic, and what meaning can be drawn from that and the evidence that goes to support that. And that's where that discussion takes place. So if you want to sort of get to the heart of an article, look at that abstract first and then look at the discussion at the end and see whether that's all starting to tie up together.
So it's about taking a strategic approach and not reading the very boring method bit all the way through the middle.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. But method is important because, again, certainly in terms of research, if you've been conducting a piece of research to find out a particular answer to a question, supposing, for example, you wanted to explore a student's perception of their course, okay? And if you do that in, say, a questionnaire that has very limited opportunity for students to talk about their understanding, so in other words, if you do it in a quantitative way rather than a qualitative way, are you going to get the full picture? Is that the right methodology for that particular question? I would argue probably no. You're not really going to get to students' thinkings on their perceptions about their module that they've been studying, not with just a straightforward question and answer survey or questionnaire. So again, methodology is very important. Has the author or authors used an appropriate methodology for what they sought to discover, for what they sought to find out? So as well as examining and critically exploring the argument that they're producing and thinking how robust that is, again, think about context, think about the methodology that was used and whether that is a robust form.
And we've seen here that in all of these studies with the water, there were very different methodologies, from Facebook right through to, you know,
absolutely.
clinical.
3 different examples there, really. The first one, obviously, was that would have been a very scientific method that was used to examine the top of the bottles. And again, the second one would have been a scientific method that would have been used to explore how plastic deteriorates in heat. And then you've got actually, well, what people are doing, you know, the actual experiences that they've had. So it's a very difficult judgment to make, and there's no right or wrong answer. To some extent, I always say to my students, you know, you could argue that the sky is green, providing you put together a really strong, powerful argument for that. It's about providing that evidence to support what you're saying.
And what I really like, Gill, about this analogy is that you've been able to show how it is possible to critically evaluate one very small and particular thing, but also drawing on the context so that you can generate both a wider argument by using these comparisons and by comparing and contrasting, whilst also being specific about one particular area.
Absolutely, but I think you also made an important point that students do feel very nervous about critiquing a piece of work that they know has been peer-reviewed, that they know has been written by what one could perceive to be eminent people. But it's not about criticising, it's about critiquing, and that is a difference. And if you have evidence for why you think something might be different or why you could see it in a different way, then that's absolutely fine. And that's what we want. We want that debate, we want that argument.
It's almost like generating all of the evidence together so you can make an informed opinion at the end, bearing in mind the fact that all of this is very solid and robust. So I must ask now, what should we do about the bottles? Because I've got a sports bottle that's 10 years old and it's my favourite one, and I suspect it's very dirty with bacteria. So what do we do?
What do we do? I think I would ask the students that, actually, or the viewers, what would they do? And I think it goes back to, you know, have you experienced food poisoning? Have you had that?
I have,
yes.
in India.
And does
but I'm very attached,
in India, right?
but
You're very attached, right? Okay.
But I'm very attached to my bottles. But you're right. We probably have very different takes on that argument from our perspectives and bearing in mind the evidence.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
Gill, that's been a really interesting session. Thank you
you
so much.
Thank you. I hope it's been helpful, folks.
Yes, I certainly think it has. HJ, has everyone got that? Is that all sorted now?
Yeah, we've just saying, a lot of people are saying just that you've got very good points and it's helpful in thinking about our studies, whether it's just undergraduate modules or postgraduate modules. And we've actually got a link in there as well, just of the skills where you study the critical thinking ones as well to go and look at later.
Yes.
So find all those
really good
there's fantastic resources. And remember, if there are any resources that you want to look at later, just go onto the website studenthub.open.ac.uk, and under each event page there's all the resources that we've talked about as well, just in case you've missed it.
Lovely. Oh, good luck, everybody, with your studies.
Well, thank you very
Thank you.
much, Gill. Thank you, HJ. That ends that session. Join me for the next session, where we're going to find out about the library and postgraduate study, which will be very, very interesting. It's basically everything I wish I'd known a while ago. So join me for that next session with Fiona Durham in just a moment. We're going to have a library tour, because our library is, in addition to being an online library, a real space, and it's a wonderful space. And the library team are so supportive. So in this video, you're going to get a chance to see the library and meet some of the team.